The escalating crisis in Indigenous child welfare is perhaps the most challenging and sensitive issue the nation faces. Since 2001, the number of Indigenous children who've had to be removed from their parents has risen from around 4,000 children to almost 14,000 children, and the proportion of the Indigenous child population taken into state care has tripled from 2% to 6%. When Indigenous children are removed from their parents, the preferred option is to place them in kinship care with either their relatives, members of the local community, or with other Indigenous people. This is called the Aboriginal Child Placement Principle, or the ACPP. The well-meaning intention is to overcome the often devastating impact that separation from their families had on the cultural identity of members of the stolen generation, and ensure that Indigenous children can maintain connections with traditional culture and identity. Unfortunately, recent inquiries into state and territory child protection systems have shown that culture and identity considerations can outweigh child welfare concerns. Indigenous children can end up receiving a lesser standard of care when they're placed into unsafe and unsuitable kinship placements that fail to meet basic standards, and into which non-Indigenous children would not be placed. Indigenous children are removed at 10 times the rate of non-Indigenous children. This reflects the significant gaps that exist between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in key social indicators. What this means is that our well-meaning efforts to avoid repeating past mistakes and prevent a new stolen generation risks undermining the efforts to close the gap in social outcomes between the most disadvantaged Indigenous and other Australians. We're in danger of creating another lost generation of Indigenous children trapped in disadvantaged circumstances. My report therefore argues that Indigenous child protection policies need to be subjected to the same national scrutiny and re-evaluation that has occurred in other areas of Indigenous policy. We need to reconsider what we're doing, why we're doing it, so that what happens to Indigenous children is in their best interests. We need to find different ways to reconcile concerns about cultural identity with child welfare. I don't think we should be excluding Indigenous children from the adoption reforms in New South Wales or the permanent guardianship laws in Victoria. Instead, we should have cultural support and education programs run by Indigenous organisations for Indigenous children that are adopted or are in permanent care. Ending discrimination in Indigenous child protection policy has vital national implications. I also think it is consistent with what should be the aim of all Indigenous policy in a truly reconciled Australia, which is to give all Indigenous Australians the same opportunities as other Australians, regardless of race.